Good afternoon. I'm Rabbi Feinstein, and this is Valley Beth Shalom live and online. It is my privilege to welcome you this afternoon to Lunch and Learn. We're going to be continuing our conversation about the classical prophets, and today we're going to take a move, a sort of turn. The prophets we've looked at so far have been prophets of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, warning of the coming destruction. Well, the destruction came. In the year 586 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, governing the south of Israel, the Judea kingdom, had taken the wealth of the kingdom, had put in place a governor, and there was an uprising after 11 years of that government, an uprising against that governor, and the people of Judea rose up against the Babylonian government, and the Babylonians decided that the only solution to this was to quell the rebellion by destroying the city. And so it was that the prophet Jeremiah, everything that he had predicted, everything that he had foreseen in his visions, everything that he was so terribly afraid of, actually came to pass. We saw that in our last episode. Well, what happened next? Well, what happens is the city is decimated, its population is decimated, the environs, of course, are destroyed. The Temple of Jerusalem is destroyed as well as a center of the rebellion, as a sort of punishment for the insurrection. And the populace large parts of the populace are carried off into exile. It was the political policy of ancient empires that to pacify a land, you take its leaders, it's the rebel leaders, away into exile. And so the leaders of the Judean kingdom were carried off into Babylon. We have records of this, or at least reflections on this, from people who appear to be eyewitnesses. And that'll be our topic today. And what I want you to look for in all of these documents, they come from the Bible, the book of Lamentation, chapters from the book of Psalms, and a section that we'll read from the book of Isaiah. What I want you to hear is the theology. How do you live with a God who has allowed or actually sponsored the destruction of everything you hold dear? We're used to post-Holocaust theology, which is built upon a foundation of modernity, in which all of the tenets of Jewish faith are questioned. And then when the Holocaust comes, it's very easy, or it's easier rather, for contemporaries to sort of throw off all faith altogether and say, I can't believe in a God that would allow such a horrifying, radical evil to destroy a people as the Nazis did. But the ancients didn't have that sort of foundation. For them, God was very real. God lived with them. So how do you explain and how do you live with God who sends you into exile? How do you live with a God who allows God's house to be destroyed, God's city, God's people, God's priests? How do you rationalize that? There's a giant problem of cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, a God who protects us, who's covenanted with us, who's connected to us. And on the other hand, the experience, the flesh and blood experience of destruction, murder, and the decimation of a populace. And that's what we're going to see today in these wonderful, remarkable documents of this moment of powerful destruction. Let's take a look at the text. So the first text I'd like to share is the book of Lamentation. Remember that at the end of the Hebrew Bible, in the section of Ketuvim, there are 5 short books called Megillot, and these Megillot are the books that are read on occasions of special occasions. So, of course, the one we all know is that the book of Esther is read on Purim because it's the story of Purim, and Shir Shirim is read on Passover. The book of Kohelet is read on Sukkot, and the book of Lamentation is read on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th day of Av, which is commemorated as the day that all of the destructions, First Temple, Second Temple, the many exiles of the people of Israel took place. It is a remarkable book. It's a short book. It's only 5 chapters. Traditionally, it is said to have been written by the prophet Jeremiah. And while the language may or may not support that, that's the way that scholars debate these things. What's interesting is that the ethos of the book, the feeling, the pathos rather of the book, does in fact reflect Jeremiah. You'll hear that in the words. What's also very interesting is what the book of Lamentation laments, what it's mourning, and what it doesn't say very much about. And we'll see that in just a moment. So it begins with the word echa. The word echa is translated by our translator of, this is the JPS Bible, as alas. Echa obviously is related to the word ech, which means how can this happen? How? And the beautiful plaintive melody of this text, Echa Yashva Badad Ha'ira Batiyam. That's the melody we read Lamentations in. It's a melody that bespeaks mourning and grief of the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the beautiful melody of this. Alas, Echa Yashva Badad Ya'ir Rabati Am. Lonely sits the city once great with people. She that was great among the nations has become like a widow. A princess among the states has become a thrall. He's walking the streets of the city after the destruction, and there's nobody there. There's nobody home. The marketplaces that were once teeming with life, the streets that were once filled with families and with business and with commerce and with community, it's all gone. It's empty. And the city, he imagines, is like a princess, like a queen, now a widow. And then he'll switch this, you'll see in a moment, like a mother, watching her children gone, wondering where are they. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheeks wet with tears. This is Jerusalem weeping for her children. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They've become her foes. Judah has gone into exile because of her misery and harsh oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. Zion's roads are in mourning, empty of festival pilgrims. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh, her maidens unhappy. She is utterly disconsolate. Her enemies are now her masters. Her foes are at ease because the Lord has afflicted her for her many transgressions. Her infants have gone into captivity before the enemy. Gone from fair Zion are all that were her glory. Her leaders are like stags that found no pasture. They could walk only feebly before the pursuer. It is a beautiful, beautiful image of a city left empty, bereft, empty of its children, empty of its children. But what's really very interesting here, as you'll see as we get through this, is he's mourning the city's loss, the emptiness of the city, the pain of its inhabitants that were left, the refugees. But there's nothing much about the temple. He doesn't mourn the temple. And this is one of the reasons why, in addition to the pathos, that the prophet Jeremiah might very well be the author of this book, because it was Jeremiah, you recall from our previous weeks of study, that pointed out that the temple had become an obstacle to faith instead of becoming an instrument, a way of faith. And so it's not the temple that he grieves for, but instead it's the city, right? All her inhabitants sigh, verse 11, as they search for bread. They have bartered their treasures for food to keep them alive. See, O Lord, and behold how abject I've become. May it never befall you. The Lord is in the right. Go to 17. For Zion spreads out her hands. She has no one to comfort her. The Lord has summoned against Jacob his enemies all about. Jerusalem has become a thing unclean. The Lord is in the right, for I have disobeyed him. Hear, all you peoples, and behold my agony. My maidens and my youth have gone into captivity. I cried out to my friends, but they played me falsely. My priests and elders have perished in the city. They search for food to keep themselves alive. See, O Lord, the distress I'm in. My heart is in anguish. I know how wrong I was to disobey. So what is his theology? His theology is he acknowledges that we brought this upon ourselves, and he's begging God for mercy, even as he acknowledges that Jerusalem is at fault for having pursued outsiders instead of remaining faithful to the God of Israel. And this dichotomy, this sort of dialectical back and forth of bemoaning the suffering on the one hand, and protesting in some ways the suffering on the one hand, and at the same time accepting our responsibility for it, and begging God for mercy is what you'll see again and again in Lamentations. What's remarkable about Lamentations is that it's 5 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 sort of tell the same story. They are told in the same voice that we've just heard in chapter 1. Chapter 3, however, is different. There's even a very different melody for chapter 3. Traditionally, when it is chanted in Hebrew on Tisha B'Av, there's a different melody. And the reason is because chapter 3, unlike chapters 1 and 2 and 4 and 5, chapter 3 is entirely in the first person. Who is speaking? Well, it could be the prophet Jeremiah himself. It could be that the poet has written for us a lament in the voice of the people Israel who have been destroyed by the Babylonian armies. It could even be the voice of the city Jerusalem, now transformed from female back into male. I am the man who has known affliction under the rod of his wrath. Me he drove on, and in unrelieved darkness, on none but me he brings down his hand again and again without cease. He has worn away my flesh and skin and shattered my bones. All around me he has built misery and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in my ways with hewn blocks. He has made my paths a maze. He is a lurking bear to me, a lion in hiding. The image of a God who pursues him, a God who's after him, a God who is pushing back, destroying him. And now, after lamenting for the first 21 verses of this, look at verse 22. But the kindness of the Lord has not ended. His mercies are not spent. They are renewed every morning. Ample is your grace. The Lord is my portion. I say with full heart, therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who trust in him, to those who seek him. It is good to wait patiently till rescue comes from the Lord. It is good for a man when young to bear a yoke. Let him sit alone and be patient when he is laid upon him. Let him put his mouth to the dust. Let there be hope. Is this a different voice? Is this the answer? So that the first 21 verses are this lament, this complaint, this cry of anguish, and the next verses, the voice of wisdom that come back, almost like Job, like the friends of Job who come back? Or is this the same one? Is this the prophet or the book's attempt to try and bring both together in one? On the one hand, the lament over the terrible suffering, and on the other hand, a sense that God has not completely abandoned us. Look at verse 31. For the Lord does not reject forever, but first afflicts, then pardons in his abundant kindness. It sounds a lot like the friends of Job. It sounds like an answer to the beginning, but at the same time, it could very well be the internal conversation within the Jewish heart. How do I stay faithful and hold on to a God who has allowed this to happen to me and to my people and to my city? For he does not willfully bring grief or affliction on man, crushing under his feet all the prisoners of the earth, to deny a man his rights in the presence of Most High, to wrong a man in his cause. Thus the Lord does not choose, whose decree was ever fulfilled unless the Lord willed it. Again, it sounds a lot like the book of Job. Is it not the word of the Most High, the weal and woe befall? Of what shall a living man complain? He spent 20 verses complaining, but now each one his own sins. Let us search and examine our ways and turn back to the Lord. Let us lift our hearts with our hands to God in heaven. For we have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You have clothed yourself in anger and pursued us. You have slain without pity. You have screened yourself off with a cloud there, that no prayer may pass through. You have made us filth and refuse in the midst of the people. And now he goes back. Now, having said that, he now goes back to the lament. He now goes back to the lament and then switches back again. You have ever drawn nigh when I called you. You championed my cause. You redeemed my life. You hear the back and forth. This is a struggle. You see, discursive theology, when you write philosophical theology, you're expected to be consistent. But when you write poetry, And that's what this is. It's poetry. You're trying to capture the conflict within the very heart. Having seen the temple destroyed, the city destroyed, having seen its populace taken off into exile, having experienced the bitterness and pain of this, at the same time, not wanting to let go of the God who promises respite, the God who promises return, a God who promises renewal. And this is the struggle of the exilic generation. The last verses of the Book of Lamentation are very familiar because they're part of our daily liturgy, our weekly liturgy, rather Shabbat liturgy, and also part of the, sort of, they're the motto, the epitaph of the book that all of us know. It's Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Let us come back. Give us the opportunity to do tshuva. Chadesh yameinu kekedem. Renew our days of old. For truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us, but take us back, O Lord, to yourself. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. Bring us home and renew our days as of old. It's interesting, by the way, that those are the verses we sing when we replace the Sefer Torah into the Ark. It's Chaim Hila Machazikim Ba, and it ends with Hashivenu Adonai Elecha. We're putting the Ark, the Torah, back in the Ark and acknowledging that we are living here in exile, not in Jerusalem, that the Ark is all that is left of our Beit HaMikdash, of the Holy Temple, and we're asking God, we're begging God to let us return to the city of Jerusalem, to our glory as a people on that mountaintop. Let us return. That's what we're singing, rehearsing, as it were, when we replace the Sefer Torah into the Ark at the end of the service. The most famous statement of this exilic philosophy, of course, is Psalm 137. It's been sung to 100 melodies, from plaintive to gospel to reggae. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? So here is a picture of the inner life of the exilic community. Brought into Babylon, settled in Babylon, they are oppressed, they are tormented, they are lonely, far away from their city, far away from the evidence of their connection with God, far away from their history, far away in a strange land, speaking a strange language, and they're tormented. They're humiliated by the captors. You can imagine what they said. You say that you are the children of the God of the universe, and yet look who you are. A peripheral, weak people destroyed in exile, whose land is destroyed, now a colony of the Babylonian Empire. Sing us one of your songs. Sing us one of your songs, you Jews. And so they hang up their lyres. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? And that is one of the questions that rings through all of Jewish history. Can we sing? Can we create life? We saw Jeremiah 2 weeks ago tell us that we must pray for the welfare of the communities in which we live and build homes there and prosper there and marry our children and have families and businesses and lives there. Ezekiel's going to talk about, the prophet Ezekiel, who is an exilic prophet, is going to talk about building Mikdash Ma'at, a small temple, a temple facsimile in alien soil. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? And then the famous plaintive response, if I forget thee, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Yerushalayim in memory, even at my happiest hour. It's a custom among very religious families to leave a section of a home unfinished, a corner unfinished, the plaster, the paint unfinished, to remember that Jerusalem is not redeemed. It is a custom among Persian Jews at the end of a wedding ceremony, before the groom will smash the glass, to sing these verses. Even at my happiest hour, I remember that I'm grieving for Yerushalayim. And it ends with a similar kind of sort of moment of rage. This plaintive, that would be the best place to end the poem, right there. But there's something else in the heart of this poet. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites. The Edomites is the Psalm's idea of everybody else who lives in the east. The day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her of her very foundation, to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, can blessing on him who repays you in kind. What have you inflicted on us? Blessing on him who seized your babies and dashed them against the rocks. Whew. He's calling upon God to curse Babylon for the cruelty they showed to the people of Israel. So the first part begins with this lament, and then there's this rage, this anger, this pain in the heart of the Jewish people who have seen everything that they love destroyed, calling upon God to curse the very destroyers. Now let's go down and to the prophet Isaiah. When we began Isaiah some weeks ago, I mentioned that the book of Isaiah is not one book. The book of Isaiah is actually three different prophets who all write within the book of Isaiah, and they have certain elements of theology, of worldview in common, and that might explain why they are included in the very book. But this one, who is called Deutero, or second Isaiah, is not the same as the Isaiah we read earlier. The Isaiah we read earlier lived in the time of the kings of Judea, of Uzziah and Chizkiah, and was part of and offered the warnings and the guidance to those kings. This is a prophet who lives a generation later. He lives after the destruction, or in the midst of the destruction, rather. This is a prophet who lives after Jeremiah, and he has a message to his people. Now remember who the prophet is. The prophet is a person who stands between God and the people. Think about Moses. In the stories of the Torah, in fact, the stories we read this Shabbos, Moses is constantly negotiating between God and the people. When God gets angry at the people and is ready to destroy them, it is Moses who mollifies, who calms him, who seeks to get God to back away and allow this people the time to grow, the time to develop in the directions that God would have them grow. But when the people violate God's law, it is Moses who becomes angry and accuses them. It is Moses who castigates and warns. And that is an emblematic of the life of the prophet, who stands between the moral absolutes of God and the reality of human beings who can never abide by a moral absolute. That's a reality of God. That's a reality of the prophet, who begs forgiveness for the people in front of an accusing God and demands of the people themselves a much higher level of moral life. So here we have a theology which imagines that the people are in exile, that they've suffered terribly, and that they deserved it, that they brought this upon themselves, that it was their very faithlessness to the God of their covenant that brought this upon themselves. We've been talking, these last weeks, that the sin, at least what I suggested, was that the sin was the sin of this chauvinism, this nationalism, that said we are exceptional, that said that nothing is demanded of us in the covenant. And that in fact the covenant, says the prophet, demands a higher degree of moral affiliation, of moral faithfulness to God. So here is the prophet who is willing to say, you did this to yourselves. But because this covenant is so precious to the prophet, the covenant is not abrogated. The punishment you are suffering is not indication that God is gone, or God is dead, or God has been supplanted by the gods of your adversaries. No, the very punishments that you are suffering are indications that the God that is part of your covenant is very much alive, and this is an emblem of that conversation, that transaction. You were faithless, and now you are punished, but no punishment lasts forever. This is a God as tshuva, a God who accepts back. So here is Isaiah in 40. if you know the synagogue world, this is the Haftorah that will be read for Parshas Vayetchanan, because that's the week after Tisha B'Av. And there are 7 Haftarot, 7 weeks, where the prophet, or this Deutero Isaiah is read as indications of, as expressions of forgiveness, expressions of comfort, expressions of bolstering the people's faithfulness as they endure the punishments of exile. Nachamu, nachamu ami. Comfort, lenachen means to comfort, to console, to bring strength, to bring renewal to a person who is grieving. Nachamu, nachamu ami. Comfort, comfort my people, says God. Different voice. This is not the voice of the God of Lamentations, who is so the bear, the lion chasing him through the forest. This is a fatherly God, a motherly God, who comforts, who consoles, who brings peace, who brings saving love to help. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and declare to her that her term of service is over, that her iniquity expiated, for she has received at the hand of the Lord double for all her sins. So the prophet says to the people, you have suffered, but you have suffered enough. And now here is a voice of reconciliation, a voice of renewal, a voice of restoration. And the image is going to be the Exodus, a new Exodus. The first Exodus was the Exodus from Egypt. This will be an Exodus from Babylon. And the Exodus from Babylon will be every bit as glorious as the Exodus from Egypt. A voice rings out, clear in the desert a road for the Lord. Let in the wilderness a highway for our God. Let every valley be raised, every hill and mount made low. Martin Luther King spoke those words on the steps of the Washington Monument as part of the I Have a Dream speech. Let the rugged ground become level and the ridges become a plain. The presence of the Lord shall appear, and all flesh as one shall behold, for the Lord himself has spoken. A voice rings out, proclaim. And another says, what shall I proclaim? All flesh is grass, and all goodness like the flower of the field. Grass withers, flowers fade. When the breath of the Lord blows on them, indeed, man is but grass. Grass withers, flowers fade, but the word of God is always fulfilled. Ascend a lofty mountain, O herald of joy to Zion. Raise your voice with power, O herald of joy. Raise it, have no fear. Announce to the cities of Judah, behold your God. So we're coming out of Egypt, out of Mesopotamia, out of Babylon, with all the glory that we came out of Egypt. And instead of rising up on Mount Sinai in the desert, we'll rise up on Mount Zion, which is the new mountain of God. And the herald of joy will give the message that God has become, that God has arrived. Behold, the Lord God comes in the night. His arm wins with triumphs. His reward is with him. Recompense his shepherdless flock. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them to his bosom. Gently he drives the mother sheep. Who measured the water and gauged the sky with a span? Only God could do this. Who has plumbed the mind of the Lord? What man could tell him of his plan? And so what's going to happen? God is going to bring low the powerful armies of Babylon. God is going to humiliate, or at least humble, the nations in the face of the redemption of his people, right? All nations are as naught in his sight. His account of them are less than nothing. To whom can you liken God? What form compares to him? The idol, the woodworker shaped it, the smith overlaid it with gold, forging links of silver. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Have you not been told from the very first? Have you not been told how the earth was founded? So what's going to happen? The prophet says to the people, don't be discouraged, don't be disillusioned. There is punishment, and punishment has been deserved, but punishment has a limit. It's expiated. A sin is expiated. And by the time you hear this message, he says, you will see that God has expiated your sin and returned you to your land. This is a firm belief in a God of history. It is a belief that we moderns in the post-Holocaust era have a very, very hard time hearing. There's a part of us that wants to hear this. It's that part of us that says at the end of Birkat Hamazon, Harachaman hu yivarech et Medinat Yisrael reshit smichat gulatenu. The Holy One, the Merciful One, bless the state of Israel, the beginning of our redemption. We want to believe in a God of history. We want to see a God that has plans for us, has a plan for history. But the problem is that every time you embrace that, you run up against the terrifying radical evil of Shoah. And so you have this very difficult conflict within the modern heart about how to read these words. But you can see what he's doing. He's speaking to an exilic people that is deflated, that is disillusioned, that is dispirited, and trying to help them remember that the covenant includes forgiveness and welcome and renewal and return, welcome back to the land. And that this is his theology. This is the word of hope that the prophet would offer a dispirited people. What he's most afraid of, I think, is that what will happen to the Jews, to the Judeans exiled to Babylon, is what happened to the northern Israelites exiled to Assyria. If they give up hope, if they see themselves as forever condemned by God, if they see themselves as abandoned by God, if they see that their God has been supplanted by the gods of their conquerors, they too will disappear into history. The northern kingdom disappeared. Its people exiled into Assyria, they assimilated into the Assyrian Empire and were never heard from again. How do you keep the southern kingdom? How do you keep Judeans believing in a God who has punished them so brutally? And the answer is you paint a picture of glorious, majestic, and powerful, remarkable renewal. Remarkable renewal. And the fragility of the nations among whom they live. You see, to believe in a God of history is to believe that the current arrangements of power are not fixed, they're not permanent. Powerlessness are plastic, they can be adjusted. And so here is what you have, here is the theology, right? Look at start at 21. Did you not know, have you not heard, have you not been told from the very first, have you not discerned how the earth was founded? It is he who enthroned upon the vault of the earth, so that its inhabitants seem as grasshoppers. Now that's important, of course, because remember that was what the spies said just last week in the Torah about the people of Canaan. No, all people of the earth in the eyes of God are like grasshoppers. Who spread out skies like gauze, spread them like a tent to dwell in. He brings potentates to naught. Potentates means emperors, kings, making rulers of the earth as nothing. That is, whatever power arrangements you see are plastic. They can be adjusted. The wheel of history turns, and those who are on the top will find themselves on the bottom. Even masu abonim haytala rosh pina, and the stone that was rejected by the builders will become the cornerstone. Hardly are they planted, hardly are they sown, hardly the stem taken root in the earth when he blows upon them and they dry up, and the storms bear them off like straw. To whom can you liken him? Can whom ye compare? Says the Lord. Lift up high your eyes and see who created these. He who sends out the host by count, he who calls by name, because of his great might and vast power, not one fails to appear. So you think that you are an exiled people, peripheral, small, weak, humiliated, dispirited, living by the waters of Babylon, peripheral to history, with no power to exert on the conditions of your existence. And the prophet comes and says, that's just not true. You are in fact the center of history. You are the center of history, and all that goes on around you, is only temporary. It's tentative, it's fragile, and it will one day be destroyed. This is not only the prophet's message to the generation that sat by the waters of Babylon. This is the ideology that got us through 1800 years of exile. This is what Jews believed in Poland, what they believed in Spain, what they believed in England and France, what they believed in Yemen and Morocco and in Persia. That we are the center of history. It's a Jewish chauvinism, but it's a chauvinism rooted in a belief in a God who has a plan for history. Why do you say, O Jacob, why do you declare my way is hid from the Lord, my cause ignored by God? There's the lament of the people. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is God from old, creator of earth from end to end. He grows faint. He never grows faint or weary. His wisdom cannot be fathomed. He gives strength to the weary, fresh vigor to the spent. Youths may grow faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But they who trust in the Lord shall renew their strength. As eagles grow new plumes, they shall run and not grow weary, and shall march and not grow faint. Wait, he says, redemption is coming. This is the role of the exilic prophet, and a remarkable message that has sustained us in all of the generations. It's only in modernity that we come to say, how can I believe this? How can I believe in a God of history? But we too are struggling, just as the people of that generation. In some ways, we struggle the opposite as they do. They were in exile and struggled with the fact that they were in exile. We who have returned to our homeland in our generation and seen it with our own eyes, have experienced the miracle of Israel's growth. We try to reconcile what that means theologically in terms of God, given the terrifying radical evil that we experienced in Holocaust. And this becomes our great struggle. That theological dialectic, that is what we struggle with today. That is the great struggle that we make today. So I would enjoy these verses today, especially these days when we are weary with pandemic and the difficulties of the world, and hope that the prophecy at least brings us a little bit of strength and a little bit of hope. This is what Jews held inside for all those generations. I am not a prisoner. I refuse to identify as a prisoner of history. I am a prince temporarily incarcerated. I'll tell you just an interesting story to complete this. Some years ago, Nina and I visited Ireland. Spent a couple of weeks with some dear friends touring all over Ireland. A beautiful country, lovely people, wonderful beer. And just a very interesting, and we would spend, the things you do in Ireland is you find yourself a pub where they play music and you listen to the music of Ireland. And the music and the ethos of Ireland is so interesting. One of our tour guides was a young graduate student from the university. He's a history graduate student. And he was taking us through the streets of Dublin, talking about the revolutions, the many times that the Irish were conquered, and the many times that the Irish rebelled against the English in order to achieve their independence. And the young man was such a funny guy. He said, well, we rebelled again in 1904 and we lost that. And when we rebelled again and we lost that one. He says, and now we're going through an economic boom. This is a great hub of software creation and economic boom, and we'll probably lose that too. And I listened to him and I asked him later, just as we were walking, are you serious? And he says, yeah. He says, there's a deep sadness at the heart of the Irish soul because we've been conquered so many times, conquered by Vikings, conquered by Romans, conquered by the Christians, conquered by the English, over and over again conquered. He said, the Irish have gotten used to being conquered. And I realized the difference, and I apologize if I get this wrong, but I think the difference between the Irish and the Jews. The Irish maintained their land, but they lost their self-respect. They lost their confidence as actors in history. Jews, we lost our land, but we never gave up our self-respect, and we never gave up our confidence in the processes of history and our faith that we would one day be redeemed. We never identified as prisoners of history. We never identified as a conquered people. We always said, yes, this circumstance is miserable, but it's only temporary. There will come a time, as the prophet says, that we'll be redeemed. And that changes everything in the way that you see yourself in the course of history. Well, I hope that you're taking very good care of yourself through this, and I wish you a very, very good afternoon. This evening, instead of my Rabbi's study program, I invite you to tune in on VBS page on Facebook to enjoy the artistic spectrum. Valley Beth Shalom is very proud to host a program called Our Space LA, a program for children and young adults with special needs. And they have a program, the adults, the young adults, have a beautiful artistic program where they create wonderful pieces of art. Under normal circumstances, we would invite you to the synagogue to tour a beautiful gallery of their art. But that's impossible now, so instead, that gallery is here online as a virtual tour, as a walkthrough. It's wonderful art made by wonderful young people with deep and beautiful souls. Please enjoy that tonight on VBS page, on Facebook, and take very good care of yourself.